Dr. Robert Person from the U.S. Military Academy to speak about Russian grand strategy. He has a lot of experience and a lot of accolades, and I could waste a little bit of time talking about that, but I'm not going to do that because I want to maximize our time for our speaker. So I'm going to go ahead and just welcome him, and thank you all for coming.
Okay. Oh, there we are. All righty. Yeah, working at the Military Academy, I'm used to using my projection command voice. So if anyone, if the guys need to turn me down a little bit, certainly feel free. Anyway, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight to speak with you on this timely topic. Didn't realize it was going to be quite this timely, but here we are. So I will, give a few prepared remarks, and then hopefully provide plenty of time for some Q&A. But again, thank you to the club, to the events organizers for the opportunity. Every once in a while, I do get to work the New York social club scene, but it's really special to be here in my home club. And to be with you at the Yale Club. So thank you again. So it's funny, the title of the talk changed slightly from what was advertised. Previously it was The March of Folly, Russian Grand Strategy under Vladimir Putin. But as of yesterday, as I was sort of revising my slide deck, decided to retitle it because, obviously we are at an inflection point, and I think there's a lot at stake right now, and so I'll try to put that into context for all of you. I will note that my remarks tonight are my personal views, not the official policy or position of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. Yes, we'll make of that what you will. So I want to start out with this. It's well known in my circles, certainly, cartoon from the New Yorker, October 1998, the begging expert on Russia. Ironically, this is actually almost exactly the moment when I started studying Russia and Russian as an undergraduate at Stanford, where I did my bachelor's degree. By the time I got to Yale for graduate school for my PhD in political science in 2003, one of the things that really sticks with me, I had a very well-meaning advisor who will remain nameless, who told me that fall, first year in grad school, listen, if you want a job in political science, don't study Russia. Nobody cares about Russia anymore. They're finished. And that is a verbatim quote, and I can still picture where this professor gave that sage advice. It was right outside Yorkside Pizza as we were walking down the sidewalk. And this is the only audience that can picture that along with me. But it has led me to sort of remind folks over the years that you may not care about Russia, but Russia certainly cares about you. Regardless of what is happening right now, with diplomatic negotiations, and yes, we can get into that. Regardless of what happens in the future, there's no question that Russia is, always has been, and I think always will be a powerful force in international politics that we have to contend with, regardless of what we want to contend with. Every new administration comes in with their foreign policy priorities, the thing to which they will they want to pivot, and inevitably something usually throws sand in those gears, and as we've seen, oftentimes Russia is the one throwing some of that sand. So What I'll do tonight is to sort of provide a framing overview sort of through the lens of grand strategy and sort of talk about sort of what that is. You'll get your little dose of academia, but then contextualize that sort of in the Russian worldview, and then zoom in a little bit, talk about how Ukraine fits into all of that and where we might be headed into the future. So grand strategy, and here you'll have to forgive me for turning around to sort of read my own slides. So the way I define it, and of course, you know, it's a concept, it's sort of a subfield of study that's long been recognized. In fact, Yale, as I'm sure many of you know, has really the preeminent grand strategy studies program in the world, I would say. You know, certainly in the country, but beyond. And so, you know, all good academics, you know, we earn a living by quibbling over definitions and splitting hairs and parsing things. So here's my definition of grand strategy. I fundamentally conceive of grand strategy as a process. It's not a set of plans. It's not the strategic document that gets published. It's a process, and it's an iterative process whereby states, and usually it's great powers, it's big states that have grand strategies because they are sort of global in their aspirations. But it's a process whereby states seek to identify their core national interests, to articulate the key strategic objectives or ends that will fulfill those interests. Then they have to mobilize the resources or the means to actually sort of be applied to achieving those strategic objectives. Then you have to figure out how best to use those resources, developing comprehensive and effective methods or ways that make the most efficient use of those constrained resources. And the fundamental problem of economics, the fundamental problem of government, and as I often tell my cadets, the fundamental problem of life is scarce resources. It's all about how you choose to allocate those. And that is really the essence, I think, of any strategy. And so if we have any folks that are military or military adjacent in the audience, you know, you often hear, you know, strategy is ends plus ways plus means. So I've translated it into those terms, mostly for my Army colleagues so that they follow along. But it's much more than just an additive equation. It's the balancing, the trade-offs of using those scarce resources, putting them towards effective and efficient methods, all for the purpose of achieving your strategic objectives. And then, of course, putting it into practice, applying that. And so this is a reminder that on some level, you know, having a grand strategy, you know, you can have a plan, you can have a theory of ends, ways, and means, and it may just be a bad strategy. It may not be up to the task of achieving what you're trying to achieve. Doesn't mean you didn't have a strategy, you just didn't have a good strategy. And of course, one of the hallmarks of good strategy is that it is adaptive, because you are not the only strategic actor in the international system that is pursuing you know, their particular you know, sort of fundamental objectives. And so you know, good strategic actors, you know, are constantly responding and adapting to the opportunities and constraints posed by other strategic actors, structures, and events, many of which are not predicted in the international system. And so this gets to sort of an age-old debate of, you know, are opportunists strategic? And I tend to argue that the good strategists are absolutely opportunists because they can see the opportunities to advance their strategic interests, to move in the desired direction, even if it wasn't part of sort of the first cut of plans. So that's kind of the academic definition that I use of grand strategy. The more, frankly, the more informal but accessible way that I sometimes talk about grand strategy is that, this is about building the type of neighborhood that you want to live in. This is about building, constructing the type of international system that is most conducive for your country's well-being, security, prosperity, and any other sort of big objectives. And so, fundamentally, when we think about, and I'm about to talk about, sort of Russia's vision of the world, their version of an ideal neighborhood, an ideal international system, it probably won't, you are a well-educated audience, and so it probably won't take you very long to figure out that their version of the ideal world looks very, very different than the vision of the ideal world that we, the United States, have premised our security and prosperity on for the last 80 plus years. And just this morning, I was going back and rereading the 8 principles of the Atlantic Charter that President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill signed in, I think, August 1941. And those 8 principles, if you haven't spent time with the Atlantic Charter recently, it's a quick read, but an important one, because again, those ideals have been the bedrock of our sense of our own national interest for a very, very long time. And I would argue that that vision is fundamentally incompatible with the grand strategic objectives that Russia has pursued consistently for the last 25 years at least under Vladimir Putin. So for the rest of the evening, I'm kind of going to gloss over the ways and means of strategy, or in the Russian case. Happy to dig into some of that in the Q&A if you're interested, but instead I'll focus a little bit more on those broad objectives. In order to understand the objectives, we do have to spend a little time thinking about Russia's worldview. How do they view the world around them? And it's not, shall we say, a very happy relationship with the world around them historically, because I think the fundamental reality is that Russia has long had a very deep and enduring sense of geopolitical insecurity. And that is a sense of insecurity that's been conditioned by Russia's relationship with the outside world for centuries. It's the product of a lot of history. It's the product of a very challenging geography. When you are a massive land empire with few natural barriers, surrounded historically by other great powers, it has, and here I always have to choose my words carefully, it yields it's understandable why they have developed essentially a besieged fortress mentality, because they have been time and again invaded by other great powers, from all directions throughout history. Just because it's understandable, and just because they feel this sort of abiding sense of insecurity, I do not think in any way justifies the aggressive actions, the illegal actions they have taken recently and in farther back in history towards their neighbors. So I sort of offer this more sort of from a perspective of strategic empathy in understanding where they're coming from without necessarily justifying their reaction to their environment. And that reaction sort of yields what I refer to as the paradox of Russian insecurity, which is to say that when they feel insecure, their response time and time again is territorial expansion, to achieve strategic depth, to establish buffer regions around sort of their core polity, their core state. But of course, every time you expand territorially, a couple of things happen. You bring new restive populations under your control that ultimately have to be often subjugated and eventually governed. And so this necessitates, the infusion of, the coercive apparatus of the state, of military forces to control these new territories. But of course, every time you expand, it brings you into closer contact and often conflict with the other great powers that surround Russia. And so, as they're expanding territorially, bumping up against other empires, other great powers, and pouring more military forces, into those areas to both secure the external borders and secure internal order, this sort of spiral ultimately leads to, an undermining of the Russian sense of security because they open themselves up to new threats with each response. So, in a nutshell, I do wonder if this is sort of, this is the scene that goes through Vladimir Putin's head, every morning when he wakes up in one of his many fabulous palaces. So, with this in mind, as sort of their broad strategic worldview, in my work, I identify 5 key grand strategic objectives that Putin has very consistently pursued over the last 25 years that he's been in power. Now, if we have any Russian history buffs in the room, I will note that many of these objectives actually we can find stretching farther back into Soviet and Russian history. So I don't want to suggest that they just sort of, were born from scratch on New Year's Eve 1999 to 2000, while all of us were worrying about Y2K, and Yeltsin is resigning the presidency and Putin is ascending to power. But these 5, I think the historical record shows that he has been extraordinarily consistent on in pursuit of the objectives. Now, the ways and means, the resources and methods that he has used over the last 25 years have evolved and have shifted in important ways. But the goals have been the same. So what are they? Number 1, he has sought to restore and reassert Russia as a great power in international politics. And that, I would argue, he was largely successful at, certainly during the first decade of his rule, sort of picking the Russian state up off of its knees, picking the Russian economy up. Now it helps when you have skyrocketing oil prices throughout that entire decade. It wasn't any particularly brilliant or insightful macroeconomic policy. But nonetheless, Russia got back up on its feet after an absolutely disastrous economic collapse following the fall of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. I mean, the 1990s were an extraordinarily traumatic decade for Russia and Russians in so many ways. And again, on some level, I think we do have to give some credence to sort of national psychology or even psychosis in understanding some of the ways in which they view the world as shaped through that very traumatic transition. So restore Russia as a great power, that's number one. Number two is to establish a multipolar international system. Again, if anybody took, I forget what the course number was, I actually TA'd for Intro to IR at Yale at least a couple of semesters. But of course, we know that the hallmark of the Cold War was the bipolar international system, the two world superpowers that were relatively even matched and balanced against one another. And in fact, a lot of scholars, Kenneth Waltz, John Gaddis of Yale fame, have written about, in many respects, the stability and the lack of sort of large-scale great power hot war during the Cold War is attributable to that balance of power of the bipolar system. But then one of your poles just evaporates, falls apart, collapses, disintegrates in 1991. And the world is left with what has now been known as sort of the unipolar moment. Of course, the first time they were writing about it, they didn't call it a moment because I think they thought it would last a little longer. But there's no question that for really much of the 1990s and fairly well into the 2000s, the system was undoubtedly unipolar. There was one global superpower, the United States. And during that time, we were able to do pretty much whatever we wanted to advance our interests globally, often over the strenuous objections of Russia. And many things that we did that were contrary to their traditional interests and desires, but were powerless to stop. And so sort of the reaction to that has long been this goal of restoring sort of a multipolarity where the United States is counterbalanced by other great powers. And I think in their conception, it's actually really a tripolar system, maybe with some other sort of second-tier sort of co-balancers. But it's really sort of a vision about Russia, the United States, and China as a more balanced power system that ultimately avoids some of those sort of indignities, if we shall say, of the unipolar moment. Now, part of Russia's vision of what it is entitled to as a great power in a multipolar system is a privileged and exclusive sphere of influence in the post-Soviet region. And it's worth digging into that a little bit. When I say privileged, this is about Russia having a seat at the policy-making table, the foreign and domestic policy-making table of its post-Soviet neighbors. It's about having veto authority over any policies that those countries might take that would counter Russia's interests. So that's the privilege that they have sought. Now, the exclusive part is that in their worldview, Russia can be the only great power to not just exercise privilege in the post-Soviet region, but to really sort of fully pursue their political and economic interests. And so other great powers, will kindly show you the exit because this is our territory. The fourth one, which you will sort of see and get inklings of in various speeches that Putin has made over the years, is there really does seem to be a vision of establishing sort of what I refer to as a concert of world powers. And if the historians want to sort of link to the analogy here, the Congress of Vienna and sort of the establishment of the concert of Europe following the Napoleonic Wars, where all the great powers sort of ideally kind of gather around a great big table and they sort of settle the problems of the world and the far-off spaces and they advocate their interests and they respect the interests of the other great powers. That's sort of Russia's, I think, ideal vision of how the world should work. The great powers sort of decide amongst themselves, or if you know, if we have any classicists in the room, right as the world goes is only in question between equals of power. The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. That is Thucydides from the Melian dialogue. No truer words were written, and that really does, I think, encapsulate sort of the Russian view of the region and the world. Now, again, if you've been with me this long, and I've never been good at slides that sort of slowly reveal and sort of build things, so you know where this is leading to. My cadets aren't always quite as quick at following. No, I'm kidding. They're really sharp bunch of kids. But if you've been with me this long, you recognize that there is and traditionally has been one really serious roadblock to bringing about this vision in the world, and that is the United States. And so objective number 5, to constrain and contain the United States and our allies as Russia's top geopolitical adversaries has been a feature of Russian grand strategy, again, for decades. So for a moment, I'll just sort of pause here and emphasize, again, the consistency of these objectives, and once again, emphasize the degree to which this vision of the world, you know, the vision of the world, you know, laid before the Melians' feet by representatives from Athens so long ago, this is fundamentally incompatible with pretty much all versions and variants of American grand strategy over the last 8 decades. So, where does Ukraine fit into all of this? Most obviously, it seems to be the centerpiece of that objective number 3, establishing that privileged and exclusive sphere of influence. Ukraine has always been the crown jewel, the keystone, the linchpin. You know, choose your metaphor, but it has always been central to Russia's conception of its privileged sphere of influence. It's been central to Russia's vision of what I refer to actually as the virtual empire, which is to say that I've never really believed that Putin was out to reconstruct the Soviet empire territorially. What he has always sought is, again, the ability to control their politics, the ability to pull the puppet strings without having to bear the cost and the pain of direct territorial conquest and rule. Essentially what he's tried to achieve is what he has in Belarus with the dictator Alexander Lukashenko, who is his willing puppet, does what he says, dances when he says dance, and more or less toes the Kremlin's line. And so I think that has been fundamentally what he has sought to achieve in Ukraine and beyond. So let's talk about what they're trying to achieve in Ukraine. I think it's really important to understand that this war in Ukraine didn't start in 2022. It didn't start in 2014 with the little green men that crept into Crimea. I argue that the war in Ukraine, the hybrid war in Ukraine, if you will, started in 2004. This was when Putin tried to essentially rig the Ukrainian presidential elections to install his preferred candidate, a loyal lackey by the name of Viktor Yanukovych, in power in Kyiv, and have the man in Kyiv whose strings he could pull. That famously backfired It failed, and it led to the Orange Revolution, during which time the Ukrainian people rose up and protested and demanded their right to be a free people with free democratic sovereignty over their political leadership. And so we know that after that, the election was rerun. The pro-Western and pro-democratic candidate was victorious. But that didn't mean that Russia necessarily just said, oh, we'll move on to other things. They obviously continued to take very active interest in Ukrainian politics. The next sort of big story then comes, I think, in late 2013. This is the point at which, ironically, that same candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, actually won a free and fair democratic election in 2010 in Ukraine. He comes back into power, and by 2013 is close to signing an association agreement with the European Union. And that is fundamentally unacceptable to Putin because, of course, if Ukraine sort of hitches its future to Europe, to the West, then it's turning away from Russia's vision of that privilege and that sphere of influence. And so the Kremlin brings tremendous pressure on Ukraine to reject that agreement, which they do. And that is what then touches off the Maidan protests, the revolution of dignity that eventually then casts off the Yanukovych government and initiates Russia's invasion of Crimea and its instigation of the separatist movements in the Donbas region. From there on, they continue to attempt to destabilize the regime in Kyiv, again, sort of cooking up a civil war in eastern Ukraine as an attempt to delegitimize and destabilize the government in Kyiv. It fails. And so they look for other ways to achieve that influence. In 2015, Ukraine is forced to sign the Minsk II agreements, the ceasefire agreements, essentially, with a gun held to their head. And many of the political conditions that Russia had insisted on in that agreement, had they been implemented, would have essentially given, as I say, it's sort of a backdoor hack into Ukrainian democracy. There were provisions in there that would have essentially given veto power over Ukrainian foreign policy to those representatives from the separatist regions that we know were under the control of Moscow. And so it was just another way to try to achieve that objective of a pliant, docile, and subjugated Ukraine. And that failed. By late 2021, early 2022, for reasons that admittedly remain mysterious, Putin had concluded that all the other methods had failed and that he had one option left to finally solve the Ukrainian problem once and for all, perhaps cement his legacy in the pantheon of great Russian state builders. And this is when he chose to initiate the outright full-scale invasion. And so I think we have to understand, especially now as we transition to thinking about, okay, how does it all end? We have to understand that this is not a fight that has been going on for the last 3 years. This is a multi-domain, multifaceted, hybrid war that the Kremlin has been fighting with dogged focus for over 20 years. So when I think about the prospects for a negotiated settlement, when I think about the prospects for a stable peace, never mind a just peace. I mean, justice is nice. But even getting to a stable peace agreement, I think there are extraordinary barriers to that. And I'll throw up a QR code in a bit to an article that I recently published that lays this argument out a little bit more formally. It's grounded in the theoretical literature on bargaining and warfare. But there's several conditions that, even though it might be in the interests of parties to find a negotiated settlement, they often fail to. So one is issue indivisibility. Not all the things that countries fight over can be neatly divided at the bargaining table. The things that can be, those are the things that we're hearing about in the news. Okay, who gets what territory? Where are they going to draw the line? And what are they going to give to Putin? And what are they going to allow Ukraine to keep? Territory you can divide. Policy you can divide. You can come up with some package of security guarantees, concessions, neutrality policies, so on and so forth. So that can all be sort of negotiated, and okay, we'll do this and that and that. And in theory, you can perhaps find that win set of overlapping interests that all parties could sort of accept. Some things over which states fight wars are actually really hard to divide and to give, this chunk to here and that chunk to here. Sovereignty, democracy, a nation's right to exist in the face of clear evidence of genocidal intent and genocidal acts to erase the Ukrainian nation from their homeland. That's what Russia's been fighting for over 20 years. And I have yet to see any evidence in their public statements of any interest or willingness to step back from those maximalist demands. And so again, I don't see on the Russian side an interest in good faith negotiations to end the war. I think what I see is an interest to continue the war that they've been fighting for 20 years, that has been central to a grand strategic vision that they've been pursuing for, again, at least a quarter of a century. So actually figuring out sort of what does this peace agreement look like, my basic argument is that even if you do end up with a piece of paper that divides territory, that puts security conditions, neutrality, security guarantees, whatever package, even if you end up with that piece of paper, and even if all the relevant parties, whoever they may be, sign that piece of paper, you will not have settled the underlying causes of the conflict. And thus, that piece of paper is unlikely to be the basis of a lasting peace, because Russia will continue pursuing the grand strategic objectives that it's been after for decades. So that's one really big barrier to the negotiated settlement. The second is the credible commitment problem. Again, even if you get that beautiful piece of paper signed by both sides, each side has pretty strong entrenched reasons to not trust the credibility of the other to uphold it. As I said, I think Ukraine has good grounds to question anything that Putin agrees to, given the long history of broken treaties and agreements and promises to respect Ukrainian territorial integrity. So I think the Ukrainians have good reason to doubt the credibility of that agreement. On the flip side, again, Russia has waged a 20-year war against Ukrainian democracy and democracy in a lot of other places. And so I think he has, certainly in his mind, some doubts about the credibility of any commitment that the democratic world would make to uphold an agreement. And so, again, I don't think Putin will feel bound by anything he signs. And so, what can you do to credibly commit to peace? Well, yes, there are external peacekeeping forces. but it's a massive, massive line of contact that would require such a huge force that even if you could find one that would be credibly accepted as legitimate by both sides, and really sort of think through, like run through the list of countries you can come up with, like who both has the capabilities and frankly the credibility such that everyone would be comfortable with them standing in the gap. I argue that that peacekeeping force does not exist. And so on those terms alone, I'm very skeptical of the prospects for a successful negotiation to end the war. I recently have taken to saying that most academics like to be right. This is one case when I very much hope to be proven wrong. I hope that my skepticism is incorrect, and that a stable, lasting, and yes, here I will say just peace could be negotiated. I very much hope for that, but I have my doubts. And one of the reasons that I have my doubts is because I'm reminded of just what it is that I think the Russians are after in Saudi Arabia with the peace negotiations that seem to have begun this very week. What are they after in Saudi Arabia? What are they actually negotiating to receive from the United States, who at the moment is their sole negotiating partner? What they're trying to receive is a pretty familiar list of strategic objectives. That's what's on the table for the Russians, and that's what's at stake. And you'd better believe that they are bringing their diplomatic A-team. They are skilled negotiators, they are ruthless negotiators, and they are, quite frankly, dedicated liars who know exactly what to say in order to advance their interests. And so, again, I will conclude sort of the formal remarks here by noting that should they find success in achieving these objectives diplomatically in the coming months, then Putin will have been far more successful in advancing Russia's strategic vision of his ideal world than he was in his previous 25 years of hybrid warfare, of military invasion, and all the other sort of coercive tools that he has used to bring about this world. So I very much obviously hope that that is not what comes of the negotiations, but we political scientists, smart though we may be, we don't have crystal balls, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think a lot that is up in the air right now. So I will end with that and simply note that if you would humor me, shameless self-promotion, if you'd like to read the longer article about sort of the barriers to negotiation in Ukraine, that QR code should take you to my recent article in the Journal of Democracy. So I'll leave that up. But at this point, happy to take questions and see where it leads us. Thank you.